Morning. Hey. We were missing you. From inside, we were missing you, and we really hope you enjoyed the weekend. Yeah, this means yes, I got that. I hope everybody survived the weekend. So I'm seeing some missing places over there. Yeah, no, let's see what happens. So if you can see, the weather is a little bit warmer today. So we have a very good point and a bad point because of thermal regulation. Again, remember the windows and the air conditioning and the struggle between people that feel too much cold or not so that. And then please, again, we can manage everything. We can manage the windows, manage this, but if you remember, when we turned it on last week, people here were freezing. Remember that? So, okay, we will manage. So let us know if it's comfortable, okay? If it's not, we can try to organize, okay? Second thing, before we move on. Did the musicians contact these people here? No, it's not at the point. Not ready yet, but you did the connections? Yes. Okay, so. We have the idea, the project. Okay, surprise, number one. And then, que mais? Luciana. Leandra. Marília also has skills, musical skills. What else? Okay, so now you are recharged. We are going to have some new issues discussed this week before we have our field trip on Thursday, okay? And then during the week we will plan these activities so that we will have the opportunity to use this field course, this field trip, to work on specific problems on Friday and Saturday when we are going to close the course, finish the course. Okay? So I would like to invite Anthony Charles. He will introduce himself, his background, but he will bring this overarching scheme or strategy to link socio-ecological systems under the umbrella of the idea of governance, if I am saying it correctly, but he will introduce these ideas and these themes to you, and I hope you have a very important, very nice moment to discuss with Tony, which is almost a Brazilian. Yeah, at least 1 week Brazilian. He was here knowing some parts of the country. So just an additional information. Today is, which one is? Okay, class 11.1 will be summarized. We are asking the students to summarize the classes so that we'll have a booklet in the end. So the people that's going to summarize this first class are Alex Cabral. Alex is there. Juliana Lourenço Gonçalves. Aqui. Adeoye Matthew Sola. Casablanca. I know that why Casablanca. José Antônio Sanabria Fernandes. Okay? First class. Second class is Latoya Chivucci. Latoya. I cannot see the letters are small. Fernanda Marcelo de Oliveira, there. Maria Carolina Hernandes Ribeiro, ali. E Mariana Domingues, lá. Okay, so prepare the summary. Please, Tony Charles. if you want to use this and walk around.
Okay.
Okay?
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I cannot really say too much in Portuguese. I only learned important words, and the only one I can think of now is cachaça. Okay, they're correcting me already here for my pronunciation. Okay. Oh, I see, I should say it more forcefully, yes, right. So, yes, it's a pleasure to be here, and I did get a small chance to visit some places that some colleagues have been working in the coastal area, well, and near coastal area of this part of Brazil. Just before this, beautiful places in Brazil. So it's like you having, yesterday you had a little break and now you're back here. I had several days of sort of break and now I'm here too. So I hope we can have a bit of fun together in this morning. I have to get down to business, I suppose, and talk about this stuff, or Alex will. What did he come here for? So I'm going to give you a little bit of an idea about, at least my thinking about this, in a way, starting up this third component of the program that you're doing here, this looking at decision-making connected with oceans. I'm going to talk a bit about some fisheries aspects in particular. My very close colleague, Jake Rice, who was here with you last week, he and I have written books and articles together, and we didn't discuss before we arrived here a week or so ago what we were talking about, but then I think he said he was going to be talking about challenges of marine science and ocean science, and which is a great topic, and I said, well, I'm talking about challenges too. So in a way, he and I are like, to some extent, bookends from the science side and the governance side. And then you also heard from my good colleague, Christiana Seixas, last week, and she and I also work on some things similarly. I say this because you may have heard some of the things I'm going to talk about already, and maybe from others. But on the other hand, maybe I'm taking some things that the next few speakers are going to be talking about. So my apologies for that. So let's get started. Oh yes, and I'm looking forward to talking to you. Certainly those that are in the tutoring arrangement with me will be meeting later on. But otherwise, if you'd like to talk, I have some business cards, and there are a few pamphlets from a project that I deal with over on the side here that I'll mention a little bit about this morning. So although I'm interested in governance and decision-making for oceans and fisheries and coastal areas at all different levels, from the global scene of United Nations, Food and Agriculture Organization, OECD, many different bodies, UNEP, UNDP, so the international, but right down to the local community level as well. Local coastal communities that are interested often in being part of the decision-making process. So one of the big challenges, which I'll get to later, is how do you involve the very local scene in the decision-making process? How can that work? And I'll try to get to that a little bit as we go along. Okay, so I'm going to start with my part of the world, the Northwest Atlantic Ocean. And this here is a map that's based on United Nations statistical areas that you might know. I live right where that line meets the coast there in Halifax Canadian province of Newfoundland is shown there in green to sort of highlight it, especially because Newfoundlanders always like to be highlighted. That's a joke. No, sorry, the wonderful people because I'm not in Newfoundland, but they're good up there too. But in particular because this was the location, especially off of Newfoundland, up on this coast of the Atlantic Ocean, where we had the largest collapse of a natural resource that we've ever seen in Canada, and it's really kind of a famous one all around the world, the collapse of the cod fishery. This is one of the trawling boats that caused the collapse of the Canadian cod fishery. Back in 25 years ago right now, so exactly 25 years ago, well actually last year, but pretty close, 25 years ago, this big collapse that looked like this. If you've, this was a wonderful report done back in around the year 2000 or so, Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. They didn't actually, really create this analysis, but they drew on it in this diagram. This shows the, as you can see at the top, fish landings or catches going back quite a long way. So 1850. You can see here, if you're assessing the sustainability of a fishery, it's very difficult to do. How do you assess sustainability? This is one area that I work in quite a bit, and I still don't know the answer exactly. But for me, when you see a situation, especially let's say in this 50-year period from 1900 to 1950, the catches are fluctuating slightly upward, but fairly stable. So when you see stability over that long a period, there's something that seems sustainable about that. But then, after the Second World War, there was an industrialization of the fishery, and many boats coming from different parts of the world, leading to this very great increase in the catch of fish there, to a point where it basically was not sustainable, and it crashed down around the year 1976, roughly. What happened around the year 1976, 1977? What happened in the world? I was told that if I just talk for 3 hours, then that's not good. So this is where, for a minute, we have audience participation. Okay. Those of you who are trained lawyers and know all the legalities of the ocean, or maybe you don't, but anyway, what happened in 1977? Yes? Yeah, extension of the exclusive economic zone, or also known as the law of the sea, or extended jurisdiction, or 200-mile limit, 200 nautical mile limit. Yeah, so that happened. So that happened at a very good time. Well, not really quite a good time, but a pretty good time for Canada, because that was right at this point here, where the Canadians were able then to take control and say, well, this is a disaster. Let's rebuild the fishery up to something better. The problem was that it didn't work, and then the biggest collapse of all 25 years ago happened right here in the year 1992. And this was huge. 40,000 people were put out of work. Whole fishing communities were basically shut down. There was no codfish left, and the cod was what had kept things going for these communities. In fact, it's why Europeans came to the Canadian coast, was for that codfish. And then here it was collapsing, first in around 1976, and a few years before that, and then 1992. Well, at that point, and so why did it collapse? Well, I've written papers on that, and biologists have looked at that. And there's many reasons for what happened. This is another with a different scale, another diagram that shows that before the 1976-77 kind of drop here, most of the catch was from outside of Canada, boats mostly from Europe, fishing out, coming to the coast outside of Canada. And then a 200-mile limit came in, and those foreign boats were not able to fish along the coast anymore. And the blue here is the Canadian boat. So Canada was building up its fishing fleet, but then with relatively little foreign catch, the Canadian catch was enough to cause that kind of big and almost final collapse, because 25 years later, this has not recovered. This fish stock has not really recovered. There's some talk that maybe it will, but it hasn't so far. So the first reaction was to blame the foreign fishing boat, the European fishing boats, for catching too much fish. But you notice that this red line here, is it labeled prescribed total allowable catch? So in marine science, you probably know this or have talked about this. In fishery science, the total allowable catch is one of those key measures. It's the decision about how much fish should be caught. And for me, one of the very interesting things here is if you take these bars, the very top of each bar shows the actual catch. Is there anything you noticed about the red line, which is how much is allowed to be caught, and the top of the bars in that period where it's going downhill? Anything you noticed there? Sorry? They could have been catching more, right? Or let's put it the other way around. The government said that or actually the international body that you're going to hear about, well, you're going to hear about some of these regional fishery management organizations this afternoon. They said that more could be caught, but that amount was not caught. Why do you suppose? Why do perfectly good fishing people not catch what they're told they're allowed to catch? Any thought about that? There's a couple of possible reasons. Yes?
It would cost too much effort, so it would be much more expensive to catch all the fish than.
Yeah, so too much effort to catch those fish, it's not worth it economically. That fundamentally is the case, because the fishing people are trying to make money. So, that's very true. But why would it have been so hard to catch the fish? I mean, they're good fishing people. They couldn't find them. Right. Well, that's amazing, isn't it? They couldn't find the fish. Right. So they were allowed to catch the fish, but it wasn't worthwhile economically. They couldn't find all those fish out there. So what do we deduce from that about, like, there's two possibilities. One is that this fish is not worth very much, so it's just not worthwhile for people to go out and catch it. So let me just tell you that was not the case. Right? The fish was valuable, they wanted the fish, but they were not catching what they were told they could catch. So one possibility is that they just couldn't find them, right? And in fact, that's a pretty good situation. They couldn't find enough fish. What does that tell us about the decision-making process, do you suppose? Like, if the agency says that you can catch a certain amount of fish, but the fishing people can't even find enough and it's not worthwhile, like, even though it is a profitable fish, they couldn't actually get those fish and make money on it. There's something wrong with that system then. The stock assessment wasn't good. Well, yeah, actually that's the case. The amount of fish that could be caught was overestimated. There was a problem with the actual fishery science, the calculations. But it wasn't only that. Even if that number had been, a bit lower, there was something happened between, because that number, the red line, was not just set by the scientists. Who do you suppose set that red line? Yeah, politicians, basically. Like, the politicians that are involved with the process with the international agency. It could be in some cases, like over here, it was entirely the Canadian government. Over here, there was an international process. But in either case, it was some body that was setting that total allowable catch, the amount that could be caught. There was a problem with the science, and then it got increased further. So just to be clear, the scientists set the number too high, and then the politicians raised the number more. Okay? So the number was lovely, very nice, but the fishing people couldn't catch it. And things were going crazy here as the fish stock was collapsing. Right? Now over here it looks pretty good. The red line is pretty similar to the tops of what you see there, the tops of the actual catches. So regulation got better in here, but it still collapsed. The fish stock still collapsed. Well, unfortunately, the regulation was better here, but the errors in the stock assessment were still there. You can't see them here. Like, there's nothing that says there were errors right here, but in fact there were. If you've ever heard of some technical stock assessment term called virtual population analysis, VPA, which is an interesting and complex technology or methodology, it was being used here in a very, very scientific way, but it was actually wrong. But it wasn't known at the time. And what I've learned from this is that even with methods that you think are really great, there's still, mistakes can still happen. You know, basically, so for me, one of the big lessons from this is what I would call humility, being humble. Not just one person, but as a whole fishery management process, being humble in that we have so much uncertainty in the ocean, and we cannot really control everything that happens, so we have to be extra careful. Which the fishing people I worked with back 25 years ago, they knew that. They knew how complicated it was in the ocean. But right after this collapse, and partly because of this particular fishery collapse, we in the fisheries scene started to talk about something that was already being talked about with the World Commission on Environment and Development, and the, well, actually here we are just down the road from the Rio de Janeiro process of meetings on sustainable development. What's the technical term for being cautious and careful? Precautionary, right. Precautionary approach or precautionary principle, that started to get talked about in here. Also, the fishing people that suffered this collapse right over here, and were the 40,000 people that lost their jobs at this point, had another complaint. They knew the ocean was uncertain, but the whole management process was treating it just like it was certain, without uncertainty. And there was another thing. They knew that the virtual population analysis hadn't worked. That was quite obvious. But in doing that, there was a certain feature about this VPA process. It only looked at one species of fish at a time. It was a single species approach. So cod was a big important fish. But the cod interact in the ocean with other similar bottom-living ground fish like haddock. So it's just another one. Those of you who are interested in totally unrelated information, in my province of Nova Scotia, we like to eat our fish and chips. We like the fish to be haddock. It's a bottom-dwelling ground fish, just like cod. But in Newfoundland, they will only eat fish and chips as cod. So they want cod, we want haddock. I don't know where you'll ever use that bit of information, but just keep that in mind. Anybody study cultures of, like cultural aspects or social aspects of fishing communities? A few of you do. See, that's a social aspect, right? Different people like different food. And this cod and haddock, they look the same to a non-biologist like me, and they really behave sort of similar. They mingle together in the ocean, but one part of Canada likes eating one of them, one likes eating the other one. Okay, use that somewhere. Now, why was I talking about that? Cod and haddock mixed together in the ocean, right? So it's not just one species. And cod eat stuff in the ocean, like capelin or herring, and so there's predator-prey interactions as well. So there's a lot of stuff going on, and the fishing folk knew that, but the stock assessment process didn't. Well, they knew that too. The scientists know that, but it was ignored in the process. So there were several complaints that people had, and so if I were to, like, if a Canadian fishery collapse were to take credit for everything that's changed in fishery management and fishery science, then I would say, well, gee, we've learned about the precautionary approach, and in terms of this single species aspect, we've learned about the thing that would broaden you out in your thinking, that it's not just one species in the ocean. The ocean is, in fact, something bigger with interactions. Oh, I know there's scientists out there. So the new method is to think about ecosystems, ecosystem-based management, or in fisheries, what FAO calls the ecosystem approach to fisheries. So I'm going to take entire credit for the ecosystem-based management idea because well, actually, the fishing people I work with in Canada can take some credit for it, because they really push this idea that single species just wasn't good enough. Oh yeah, okay, well, there. So things were pretty bad, but there were some possible futures, and I wrote this article in a newspaper in Canada right after the cod fishery collapse, and I was trying to be quite positive. There is a future in fish, it says there in the headline. And so I was proposing, right here, you can read this quite clearly, I hope, that I was proposing some measures that I'm going to talk to you today about. This was 25 years ago. Some of these I'm still talking about today. Some of them have actually happened. Some of them, or many of them, I learned from the fishing people themselves. But one thing I learned, which is more legible because you can see it there, is about the conservation interests of fishing people and people that live by the ocean. And it's amazing. It sort of brings tears to my eyes just thinking about people in Canada. Now I've been to Trindaje, for example, where the fishing people are working in a national park involved with kind of ecotourism activities, and they're developing like more livelihood opportunities for themselves, but they're also showing how they are interested in environmental aspects. Sorry, that's the community up the coast from here. So it seems to be all over the place that there's local fishing people and local communities that care about their protecting their environment. And that was something I discovered back 25 years ago. So what I'd like to do now is run through a few areas that I think are really, well, let's call them key ideas in ocean governance, and give you a little flavor for that. And then I'm going to talk about some of the particular sort of directions, I guess. So it's first of all some ideas, and then some directions. First off, and I don't know if you will have seen, like I said earlier, seen anything quite like what I'm talking about here, but I'm just going to do it anyway. Values. Values, not the value of something like economic value, but values that people have I've learned are amazingly important. I learned this in particular as I was supposed to introduce myself originally. This is a good time for that. Okay, yeah, Google will do it. So I was trained as a mathematician, and originally, well, first as a mathematician, then as a mathematician doing mathematical models of fisheries. And then a mathematician who was also working in sort of economics, working on what's called bioeconomic models. Models that combine a biological population dynamics with some economic features and looking at optimizing or studying the behavior of fishery systems, how things develop over time. My doctoral thesis, if any of you care about doctoral theses over here, was on a model of how investment in fisheries could take place in an optimal way, taking into account the fluctuations in fish stocks and the costs of fishing boats, and especially the fact that you could not necessarily get rid of the fishing boats once you bought them. So if you buy fishing boats and then the fishery collapses or goes down a bit even, you're not going to be able to make as much income as you planned to make when you invested in the fishing boat. So this kind of optimization of investment, so that's an economic aspect with a fluctuating fish stock, which is the reality. Now, I wasn't thinking of anything as terrible as the collapse of the cod fishery, which happened, like, I don't know, 10 years after I finished my thesis. But it was, that collapse of the cod fishery really was a huge, like, it was like the ultimate indication of how you can be left with too many fishing boats if you overinvest. But that doesn't mean you can't invest because you need fishing boats. So you have to figure out what the right level is. If you'd like, we could go off right now. I could just show you all my thesis, but let's just leave it. So mathematician, but then I eventually got more, so mathematics, then into economics, then into social science, and so that Google probably, you know, talks now about like social science stuff that I do. And part of that is learning from indigenous people in Canada who I work with, who said, Tony, values, get it straight. We don't mean money, we mean values. And so I kind of started to learn about how values come first and then other things come after values. So like objectives, I understand objectives. Values took me longer to kind of get an idea of values, but objectives, sure, there's biological, social, economic, equity, which is kind of social aspects. And here was a paper I did a very long time ago that actually tried to combine the modeling stuff that I had been trained in with the social stuff that involved multiple objectives. Systems. I became very keen on the idea of a fishery system. I even published a book on it, Sustainable Fishery Systems, that tries to look at the fishery in a holistic way. And this has now become what's called the ideas of social ecological systems. I don't mean that my book, you know, created social ecological systems ideas, but the idea of a holistic approach is reflected in the book and reflected in that idea of a social ecological system. I think Christiana Seixas maybe talked about, maybe various people have talked about social ecological systems, but let me assume that they didn't. And I will just say, so the social part is really humans. It doesn't mean just social in a kind of narrow sense. And the ecological is the natural world, not counting human stuff, if you like. Even if you think of humans as part of the natural world, let's just separate a bit. So so it's not just ecology though, because it includes biophysical or just physical aspects. Ocean currents is part of the, so we got this funny term, social ecological, where the social doesn't mean just social, and the ecological doesn't mean just ecological, but the key idea is that you combine them together in a package. And that's what, this book came out in 2001. I'm doing a new version that the publisher wants next year. And this is a diagram that I have in that book, which is basically just trying to show, so the way I labeled it was the natural ecosystem, the human system, and up at the top there, the management system. This, so I called that the human, and by the way, these are 3 different circles because I didn't know how to do it any better. If I were doing it now, maybe some of you know how I should do this, I would show the human system as embedded in the natural ecosystem and the management system embedded within the human system, kind of like a cone, or you know, where one's embedded in another. So a nice 3-dimensional diagram would show that these aren't really separate things. Just like the social and ecological are not separate things. So this was my, you know, the way I was looking at the idea of a fishery system, all the interacting little lines that go from, say, the community down here or the resource users to the ecosystem to the management system. And now, since this book came out, the term governance has become more common in fisheries and in ocean discussions. And that is a strange thing. If you're ever writing a paper, an article about thinking about decision making in the ocean, and if you want to really have a proper literature review, do not just search Google Scholar for the word governance. Because I can tell you that 10 or 15 years ago, nobody used this term governance when it came to oceans and fisheries, certainly not fisheries especially. It's just recently, I now have some books that have the word governance in the title, but it's very new, so you will not get a proper literature review. You'll miss, for example, that my wonderful colleague Evelyn Pinkerton in Canada, along with a couple of great Europeans, basically invented, like from an academic point of view, the concept of co-management, cooperative management. They didn't use the word governance. This was 1989, I think, something like that. And there were already examples of co-management in the real world, but academically they sort of developed this thinking. So Pinkerton has this book called Cooperative Management of Fisheries, something like that. And you would miss this entirely if you only search for the word governance. So be careful, because that's a new thing. Okay, so yeah, systems, sustainability, yes, okay. So I've done a lot of work over the years on how do we assess sustainability. And for me, the first step is to make sure that we are looking at all the different aspects of like where are we wanting sustainability? It's good to have it in a fish stock. So if the cod in Canada was sustainable, which is not now. I mean, actually, it's been depleted down to a level that you could call sustainable because it's not going down and it's not going up. So it's sort of sustainable, but it's really bad. So that's not really what we want. But more broadly than what the ecosystem-based management thinking tells us is, well, don't just think of the one fish stock, think about the ecological sustainability. And social sustainability and economic sustainability. In some of my papers, I combine these into what I call socio-economic sustainability, and I have another heading on community sustainability, because I'm very interested in what I would call, there's individualistic sustainability, like people being able to sustain individual livelihoods, and then there's collective sustainability of a fishing community, let's say. How do you measure collective sustainability of a fishing community? Well, partly you want to have a healthy fish stock and healthy ecosystem, and partly you'd want to have an economically viable situation, but what else would you look for if you were thinking about not an ecological community of fish, but a human community along the coast? What sort of things would you look for to have a sustainable, healthy community with good well-being? Like what might you look for? Just anything you think, like, you know, your own community, your own neighborhood of a city, whatever. What would you look for?
People knowing the natural resources they have and appreciating them because of the relationship they have with them.
Okay, so people understanding and appreciating their local natural resource base. And that's in their heads, right? Like that's not like what they do, it's what they know and how they feel in a sense. What else would you say, like for the community? It doesn't have to relate to fish or anything, like, but just a community. What would you look for in a nice, healthy community? So, say again? Culture. Ah, okay, yeah, like passing on from one generation to another, like so we might talk about the elders in a community, the young people learning from the elders and passing on knowledge, passing on culture. Sure. Anybody else got one that, yes, please.
Cohesion.
Ah, yes, cohesion. Social cohesion, we call that. There's another term, social capital is another term that's sometimes used. How does the community come together? Well, I mean, I just saw some really wonderful communities on the coast of Brazil and inland Brazil that you know, when there was a huge flood in a community called São Luís a few years ago, the community came together and you know, saved lives and rebuilt the community. You know, there's like that social cohesion, that, you know, community coming together. So I don't show it here, but that's the sort of thing, actually in this paper here in the journal Ecological Economics, that's how I was talking about it, socioeconomic sustainability and community sustainability. But however you do it, the important thing is to make sure that you're covering the right, you know, the right pillars or components. Resilience, well, sustainability and resilience, some of you maybe have studied resilience, but this has become a really popular term these days, and so it's, you know, remember this is a little section on key ideas, and resilience is something to be thinking about. Even now, some people would say that resilience is more talked about in ecosystems than in human systems, but I actually think it's getting pretty even. And in fact, resilience is now treated as a key concept in talking about social ecological systems. And it's about the system and not about any individual. Although you can also talk about the human resilience of an individual person. Like if you have a disease and you overcome the disease, then in a sense you personally are resilient. Your human body is resilient. But we can talk about resilient institutions the same way we can talk about resilient ecosystems. And that's something that's not known so much. Okay, I've got to go faster here. Scale. Everybody knows there's time scales and spatial scales that we can look at, and there's also organizational scales. So we can talk about the local governance, national, regional, global governance. So we think about decision making, we can talk about Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations at the global level, and we can talk about how the local community of Parachi deals with local issues. Uncertainty, well, I put a whole bunch of stuff together here. Uncertainty, complexity, and attitudes. And this is what I was referring to earlier about how the fishing people in Canada had a good idea about uncertainty and about complexity and about the right attitude when you think about a natural resource, especially a natural resource that has such high uncertainty as almost everything in the ocean does. I won't go through this. These are a couple of terms that I've referred to in some papers where I've written about the collapse of the Canadian cod fishery, illusion of certainty and fallacy of controllability, which is sort of like illusion as well. The basic idea is if we have the wrong attitudes, we think we know everything, like we're so smart that we know everything. So that's sort of the illusion of certainty. But also this controllability idea is the idea that we can control everything out in the ocean. We can manage ecosystems. Well, you know, it's pretty hard to actually, I mean, on land we might try to manage an ecosystem, but it's pretty hard in the ocean, although there might be something we can do. But managing people in the ocean is just as hard. Unless you have a lot of money for monitoring, you have to often rely on the social cohesion of people to do the right thing, which comes back to the communities conserving their local resources. Rights has become a big topic. I could give a whole talk just on rights. Use rights, who has the right to use the ocean? Who has the right to manage things in the ocean or in the fishery? And the top one there, human rights. It's a relatively new discussion in oceans and fisheries, talking about human rights. What are the human rights involved in terms of fairness and justice for people to be able to access food for themselves, for example, along the coast? So how do these interact? Human rights, use rights, and again, I don't have time to really go into it here, but one really nice example of rights is territorial use rights in fishing, originally popularized by social science researcher Bob Johannes in the Pacific Islands in South Pacific. But now we're finding territorial use rights all over the place. Mexico, Canada, I mean, many spots have the idea of use rights that are defined by the territory, by the space. Global drivers, sustainable development goals, a really big thing. If you haven't been talking or looking at sustainable development goals, this is driving the whole international agenda now. Sustainable development goals. You, no matter what you do, I'm afraid, need to know something about the 17, I think, sustainable development goals. Good governance, okay, I'll skip that. And finally, interdisciplinarity and integration. The whole idea of how do we work in an interdisciplinary way? This again has become a big deal. Mostly the interdisciplinary part has become a big deal amongst researchers. The integration part has become a big deal among managers. How do you integrate different sectors of the economy, for example? Maybe you've been talking about this, but I think this week some of the discussion is going to be around things that are not just about one sector of the economy, but they integrate together. Okay. Yeah, so key approaches. So now I want to shift from this set of ideas into particular approaches for ocean governance. Now, different people have different definitions of governance. In a good presentation, I would have presented I would have defined governance at the start. But here I am, well into my presentation, and didn't really define governance. So this is a good chance, because I don't know what the definition is to turn to the audience and say, what is governance? But let me start with a different question. What is management? What does it mean to manage? Okay, some of you deal with fish, right? What does it mean to manage a fishery? What are you doing when you're managing a fishery? As I walk back here, this is putting the pressure on the people at the back. You know this, yes?
To define and apply the rules to control the sustainability of the fishery.
Yeah, that was nice. Were you reading that? No, right. How did you say? To apply the rules and the regulations for the sustainability of the fishery. Okay, and I was just talking about what sustainability might mean, but give and others get ready, because it's not just him. What would be an example of a rule for managing the fishery?
Catch quota, or a ban, a temporal or special ban for a fishery.
Okay, catch quota or a total allowable catch, a spatial or time-based closure of a fishing. So you can't fish in a certain time period, you can't fish in a certain location. Okay, someone else now, why would you not be able to fish in a certain time period? What would be the reason for that, perhaps? Sorry, just one. Breeding season, okay. Anybody else? Oh, sorry about that. Okay, it's getting dangerous here. I'll step back. Sorry, any other? So breeding season, you wouldn't you would want to let the fish, as we might say in English, do their thing during the breeding season. Anybody, any other reason why a certain time period? Migration season. Okay, so the fish or whatever animal it is might be migrating. Anything else can you think? Sorry? And what? And can you describe that? Oh yeah. Okay. So yeah. So different kinds of disasters, storms, and so on. Yes. Bycatch of other species. Sure. So some time period where species are particularly mixing, like for example cod and haddock, which you know very well now. Yeah. And dolphins, yes, marine mammals, yes, marine mammals moving through, which kind of connects also with migration in some cases. Yeah, and what about, well, okay, so sort of similar, but what about spatial aspect? Why would you close a certain location in the ocean? No fishing there. Okay, a nursery for the animals, the fish. Anybody else? Upwelling zones. So why would you close?
Yeah, because in the upwelling zones you have a lot of nutrients and a lot of production, and with that you have a big fishery resource.
Okay, yeah. So sort of protecting the source of the nutrients in a way for the fish. Sure. Anybody else got one they want to throw? Yes, please. Ah, right. Okay. Yeah. Good point. A contaminated location. Yeah. So it's sort of like it's not. So it's not all about the fish. I mean, it's about protecting ourselves too. Yeah.
Oil ridges, they have a zone nobody can access as well.
Okay, an exclusion zone around an oil rig, oil platform, and we could extend that to other things that we're not supposed to be touching, like military zones, for example, or something like that. Sure. So there's many reasons for these different, and those are only 3 of probably 100 management measures. So the quotas or the total allowable catch, the spatial zones, and the time closures. So that's fishery management. What about governance? Yeah, that was fisheries, right? Actually, we could have the same questions about ocean. Like, for example, the closure for where the oil platforms would be and not allowing fishing where the oil platforms are. I mean, that's an example of integration because you're dealing with 2 different economic sectors at the same time. And it's really about ocean governance or ocean management. What about governance now? What's the difference between governance and management? Yes? Yeah, great. So it's the network of people around these decisions that we're making. Yes.
Network that makes governance is about developing more horizontal relationships, decision and power decisions.
Good. Yes. And what do you mean by horizontal? Like, just describe a situation where there'd be horizontal aspects.
Because here in Brazil we have a lot of discussions and we have some degrees of participation that people say and participate, but they're not taking into account really token approach. And I think more horizontal is really taking into account the different opinions of different stakeholders.
Okay, good point. So we've got the people, the network of people that are involved, and the sort of interaction and may I say the power of different participants in the process. Because you can have the network of people, but in some cases, and if we go back to this term co-management, in some cases, some of the people are merely being told what's happening. They don't really have any power. And so they're part of the network of governance, but they're not really enabled or empowered in that way. So yes, and so you notice this point. I mean, it's about the people and who gets to make the decisions, and who has the power, in that process. So it's quite, yeah. It's not the actual decisions themselves in a sense, but it's sort of the people and actually just to broaden that a little bit, it's also the institutions that are involved in this whole package of the network of the people and the power that they have and so on. The institutions, and I don't mean like you know, the building here, the university, but I mean, because an institution can be, you know, a small religious site. I mean, it can be a community center in a local area, but it can also be the United Nations. And it doesn't matter if there's a building or not. It's that way, the ways that people come together. So, and by the way, it's also that values thing that we started off with. Now, I have to say that like I was saying about how this word governance is fairly new in the whole picture, you mustn't ever think that things like values and institutions and networks of people doing things, that was only discovered when people started using the word governance. That would be really weird. Like, you know, whoa, we got the word governance, now we know that there's networks of people and there's institutions and so on. Whoa, we didn't know that before. It's been there for 100 years of study in fisheries and oceans, but we only started using the word governance. But, so where was it? Well, you know, it's typically in discussions of what was called policy and planning in the past. It was in discussions of this term co-management that I'm mentioning, although that's even more recent. Like, if you look at fishery policy and planning, that goes back at least 100 years, and they were talking about who's involved in the decision back then. So it's not something new. There's new jargon that we have, but it is, you know, the ideas have been around. Oh, look at that. That's handy. The Sustainable Development Goals. So again, these are approaches that I want to go through fairly quickly, and my bosses are going to let me know when the break time is. So I'm going to flag these and, you know, not talk about them a lot, but I've already said that the Sustainable Development Goals has become the big international way of talking about everything. Like, just amazingly everything. Sustainable development, the term sustainable development, you know, was first popularized by something called the Brundtland Commission back in the late 1980s. And then every government and every corporation and every organization and NGO and everything, everybody started using the term sustainable development. And nobody knows what it means. There is, you can quote, maybe some of you have the quote from the Brundtland Commission about taking what we want now and leaving stuff for the future. That's sort of pretty close. No, that's not really, but this idea of, it had a lot to do with the time scale of meeting the needs of the present while leaving sufficient for the future. That's kind of the original concept. But now, Sustainable Development Goals, and you might know that before these there was the Millennium Development Goals, which got a lot of attention, but I would say these are getting more attention. So now, one of my things, well, actually, I'm doing a project with FAO right now that is all about linking together number 1 and number 13, poverty and climate. And how do you have poverty reduction that also is sensitive to climate needs, and how do you have climate adaptation that is also thinking about poverty reduction at the same time? And but the fact is that people dealing with oceans spend a lot of time talking about number 14, life below water, which is, to me, the funniest of the terms, because it's like, I'm spending too long on this already. Move along, Tony. No poverty and zero hunger and good health and well-being and quality education and gender equality, let's say just those 5. These are what I would call aspirational goals. These are things that we strive to achieve. And they put very nicely there, right? Like you can't do it overnight to have no poverty in the world, but it's something we want to achieve. Life below water. Now, we do want life below water. I mean, but it doesn't say exactly what we're trying to achieve. Now, but that's only 3 words, and there's much more to it, and there's whole targets about this. And in fact, if you delve into this, it really has to do with the sustainable use of the oceans. And so it has a lot to do with this program that you're dealing with right here, right? So, but my appeal to you is never let anybody focus only on number 14. Always look for the linkages. Look for how life below water can be sustained better if we have responsible consumption and production, or if we can reduce inequalities, or if we have decent workplaces so that people are not desperate to take stuff out of the ocean because they've got some decent work. Like, I'm just making these up in a way, but what my point is that everything connects. Number 15 is worded in a similar way, life on land. Well, as intellectual people would say, well, duh. That's hard to translate. But life on land and life under below water. But we know, people that study the ocean and ocean uses know that life on land affects life below water. So, I mean, those two are closely linked. So there's linkages among all of these. And for me, the strength comes when we look at those linkages. It's that systems thing again. Oh, there. OK, well, I'm going to skip that. Integration across the SG. I said that, right? Oh, here's a good one. I love small-scale fisheries. So this new guidelines, relatively new now, voluntary guidelines for securing sustainable small-scale fisheries. The small-scale fishery guidelines are brilliant. I mean, I had a tiny role in helping to write them, but it's a huge process that involved civil society, people, fishing organizations and others around the world, and people at Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN did just a beautiful job on this. If you want to see one document that shows how we should look in an integrated way at something in the ocean, small-scale fisheries, and by the way, actually it could be in the middle of the Amazon as well, because this is not just ocean stuff. Just have a look at this document. It's not very long, and it's beautiful. It talks about decent work. It's like it's like they knew what the Sustainable Development Goals were. I mean, it talks about decent work in the fishery. It talks about gender equality in the fishery. It talks about climate change impacts. It talks about the responsibility of fishing people to conserve the environment. Oh, it's just brilliant. Okay, enough of that. Ecosystem-based management. I've done a lot, as I was sort of suggesting, on ecosystem-based management. This was a student of mine, Rachel Long. Her work, which is published a couple of years ago, looking at the ingredients of ecosystem-based management in the marine world. And this was from a chapter I did on the human dimensions in marine ecosystem-based management that tries to show. So this is a term I like. There's some social scientists that don't like the term human dimensions. But basically, for me, it's just a helpful way to talk about the human aspects that we need to think about. And so here you've got human dimensions, and over there too, it doesn't show up, and certain interactions. And so the idea of this diagram is that the actual effectiveness of ecosystem-based management comes from looking at these human dimensions. This was in a book that wasn't just about the human side of things. And so my chapter was trying to emphasize how the human stuff fits into different tools and instruments, different trade-offs, and so on. So number 1 was Sustainable Development Goals. Number 2, ecosystem-based management. Number 3, integrated ocean management. And if I was a little more modern, I would call this integrated ocean governance. But because now people kind of use these two terms, management and governance, but really it's meaning the same thing in this context. Integrated, holistic approach to managing human uses in the ocean. Integrated ocean management. There's a couple of academic journals. One is called Ocean and Coastal Management. The other one's just called Coastal Management. And by the way, in much of this discussion, my mind is on the coast as well as the ocean. So, you know, looking both right on the coast, that includes coastal communities, but also way out in the high seas even, way far from shore. This idea of integrated ocean management is managing the different uses of what's going on in the coast and in the ocean. So in this community of Trindade, up the coast here in Brazil, tourism is a big thing. Fishing is the traditional thing. And how do these two come together? Well, the fishing people have fought really hard to get fishing rights in the national park there, which they have at the moment achieved, and they have exclusive rights to give boat tours to some of the beaches in the national park. Now that's brilliant. That's brilliant because while they're giving the tours and making some money from it and also doing their fishing, they are taking responsibility for the environment in that area, even though it's a national park. I mean, what I was told is that there's not a whole bunch, there's not a large number of government enforcement people, so a lot of the management comes to the fishing people to do, and the community to do. It's a brilliant setup, and you can find that in various different places. So connecting together the different ocean uses. Well, here's an example. It's a colleague of mine, Patrick McConney, from the Caribbean. It just shows some of the different human uses and environments like seagrass and mangroves in some of the coastal resource systems in the Caribbean. So what this is meant to depict in a simple way is all the connections. Right? So if you're trained as an ecologist, this is wonderful because everything connects in an ecosystem, and in a social ecological system, everything connects. You know, so it sort of fits nicely. There's going to be some discussion this week on marine protected areas. For me, so I'm not going to go into detail on this at all, but there's two points just to make quickly. Marine protected areas, the idea of a spatial regulation of the uses of what happens within a certain spatially defined area. This is a huge deal. This is one of the big forces in the world right now is protected areas, especially due to the Aichi targets and the Convention on Biological Diversity that are really driving this process. But because I am particularly interested in humans and how humans are living and using and connecting and managing the coast, I'm especially pleased that the Convention on Biological Diversity, which its mandate is about biodiversity, they are really conscious of how people are not only a problem but also a solution. And if you were to take, one thing from this talk, it would be that idea that people are the solution, although people can be the problem too. So this was an article I wrote with a number of really great, nice people, especially some people in the FAO on, well, you can see fishing livelihoods as key to marine protected areas. Fishing livelihoods as key to marine protected areas. So we can talk about that later on, thanks, in terms of how that works, and I don't want to take too much away from what's going to come up on MPAs either. But just to show you one of my favorite communities in Canada, which I've never been to, but I've written about it. Is this community of Eastport over here. This photo credit is from a site called Eastport MPA. The reason I love that spot is that the fishing people there, after the famous cod fishery collapse that I was talking about, all they had left, they didn't have the cod, all they had left really was lobster, the Canadian maritime lobster stock. And they, the fishing people, brought in, invited in, asked to come some scientists from the university and from government, and they worked together to figure out what locations in their community should be protected to make sure the lobster fishery stayed healthy in their community. This is not new to Canada. You see this in other places. We have, like this one spot, the Philippines has hundreds and hundreds of community-based marine protected areas. So they brought in scientists, they figured out some spots, they stopped fishing in those spots by themselves. This is the stuff I love, you know. They decided to stop fishing in certain locations where the lobster were, you know, like we were talking about, spatial areas with where the reproduction happened and so on. And then they liked it so much that they asked the government to create a formal, official marine protected area, which also had the benefit of keeping other people out of the area too. Like they could see that it was good for them, but also it meant that other people couldn't come in and destroy what they were already protecting there. And on the right there is a freely accessible FAO publication that's on the FAO.org website that's giving a whole bunch of examples from different parts of the world about this idea of MPAs and livelihoods and food security. So, so marine protected areas, the people side, I'm fascinated by that. I actually have a paper called The Human Dimensions of Marine Protected Areas that, that focuses on some of this stuff. And there, well, there it is, look at that. So that paper listed 10 key areas that on the human side of dealing with marine protected areas. And I think actually they tend to apply elsewhere as well, but there's a few that are very specific to MPAs because, like number 7, deal with displacement. Displacement is where people get forced or moved out of the marine protected area. They can't fish there any longer because the marine protected area is protecting the resource. So some people get into big trouble like when that happens. So in South Africa, there's some really bad situations where whole communities along the coastline can't access where they usually fish because there's a marine protected area there. A marine protected area that was put there without the local community having any, what were we talking about earlier, any power, any involvement, any say in that process. So, so there's good examples and not so good examples. I'm going to come back to that. This is where I'm going to just ask you, and again, you know, I don't want to get too much into MPAs, but marine protected areas, some of the community-based conservation aspects, which I'm going to talk about after the break, and some of the aspects that involve local communities. Again, this is something which, again, I'll talk about later, but these pamphlets that I have here are connected with a project that a couple of you are actually involved in here, the Community Conservation Research Network. I'll talk about that later. But this idea of governance as a way for people to be involved in the process. Before the break, I just want to see if there's maybe two examples, 2 cases that some of you might have, where people have been involved in the decision-making process about oceans or fisheries. Anybody? Yes, please.
We have extractive research in Brazil, and there's one in North Sea, finding conservation, that people really make the rules.
Sorry, just one moment. Because I know recent microphones here.
Here in Brazil, we have the extractive reserves, And I knew a place in Ceará, Prainha do Canto Verde, Risex, that people make the rules over there, but they have some issues, but they decide, and it's lobster fishery.
And does government support that?
Yeah, the reserve, it's one of our categories of protected areas, so they have to monitor, and the team, the government team, are always with them and making this management.
Okay, there was another one right behind. Oh, could you pass the mic here? I'll sit here. Oh, okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm from Venezuela. So we have a national park there. It's a couple of islands there, but the government wasn't successful just to protect the marine area in some case, in some species like turtles and lobsters. And they were an ONG who made a work there with the fishermen, and now they have an educational, environmental education with the people there, and now there are protected some species there by the community. No just to the government, because I think it's the place is too big, and there are not so many people working in the environmental ministry to do the protection of the area. But now there are some people working from the community to protect the marine area and try to protect them. How can I say that? The resource from them, because they live from the tourism there and from those resources to eat. So I think it's a good example to work with the community and making the educational programs inside the community to be successful.
And they're doing it without the government, are they?
Yes, without the government.
Okay, do we have, and we'll have another chance after the break too, but oh, sure. Any, hi there. Anybody else before the break just want to throw in an example? Yes.
There's a case in the Mexican Caribbean in the coast in front of Quintana Roo called Punta Allen, where they protect lobsters. It's a community, it's that territorial...
Use rights in fishing,
yeah.
yes.
Yeah, that's the only thing I know, because one of my undergraduate professors always talked about that example.
Sejo. Juan Carlos Sejo?
No.
No, another...
I don't remember his name.
I work with people that work in Punta Allen, yes.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Are we out of time? 5 minutes. Okay, okay, one or two more at the back there. Where did the microphone? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I don't know how the microphone's suddenly going to arrive there.
Hi, here.
Hello.
Hello. In Mexico, we have a marine protected area, a very successful one. It's called Cabo Pulmo, National Park of Cabo Pulmo, where the fishermen decided to close the fisheries. So they just, they work with diving, snorkeling, and tourism. And it's one of the best ones of all Mexico, and like socioeconomically, they have a lot of money. It's a little town, but they're doing really good. And the other marine protected areas of Mexico, well, in Baja, usually the fishermen tell the government to do them, so they could have a better support and administration.
Thank you. So, and where was the first one located? In Baja California?
Baja California Sur, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And there. And also, if you have an example that's not, I mean, several of these are sort of connected with protected areas, but there can also be community involvement without, and I think one or two of you had examples also without protected areas. So, I mean, there's different ways, of course, of making decisions. Yes, please.
Yeah, well, in Mexico, there is a lot of examples of how the community is involved with the management, because since this idea of the co-management goes through the law, you cannot decide anything without consulting fishermen. So, well, I could say that, for example, in the shrimp fishery, that is the most valuable fishery in Mexico. Well, people, you have to do, well, I used to work in the National Fisheries Institute, so you have to do these meetings with the fishermen and to communicate the results of the evaluation and to say what's going to happen. But in the other hand, they are responsible for the temporal closure of the fishery. There is a lot of fishermen that are involved with the how to say, they have to take care that there is no one catching illegally. And they are cooperating with the police and all these people that is working together to take care of the fishery.
Thank you. And maybe one more, and then we can come back to this after the break as well.
And hi, and here in Brazil there's some areas that are protected because of the sea turtles, and there's a project here called Projeto Tamar that work with that, and it's very interesting because the fishermen use it to receive money selling the turtles' meat, and when it got prohibited to do that, they just lose this economic. And now this project actually is giving them the opportunity to do some souvenirs, some artisanal ones. So the stores of this project sell their things, and all the money is given back to these people. So when the law said, no, you can't just sell the meat of the sea turtle, they lose their jobs. But now they have another job that is working with the project and selling the stuff. So that is very nice, because when you take the economic of a community, it's very complicated. But they didn't take. Actually, they give a new opportunity to do a new thing, and that's really nice.
Yeah, that's okay. There's enthusiasm for
just
one
two more, and then we can.
Yeah, maybe one. Yeah.
It's just a thing. We have some colonies of fishermen in Brazil. It's like councils from different zones in Brazil. And it has nothing to do with protected areas, but is the community making their own process about the sector.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And yeah, okay, whatever's happening, it's fine. But after the break, we'll come back. I'm going to say a few more words afterwards, and then if anybody has, well, or if you have more examples of, no, that's fine, yeah. But just keep thinking about this over the break, too. Yeah, thanks.
I just wanted to comment before the break, because it has to do with, she said, of Tamar project, that at the same time it's like an alternative for people to sell their handcrafts and such. But when I worked there, I saw that they use it to threaten the community with this, like, if you don't do what I tell you to do, I won't buy any of your artisanal stuff, so you better do what I say. And they had a horrible dialogue, and the community hated the project. So there is also this side, how things are made and how things are discussed, because there is a great opportunity, but it was made in a horrible way, and they were like, they didn't have autonomy in what they were doing, and they were constantly threatened. So they felt so bad. Sometimes they would steal the eggs, and like in purpose. It's like, okay, it doesn't work, so we come back to what we did before. So just to put a balance on this.
Okay, thank you. And this is some of the, shall I say, the complexities of the process that Yeah, I do want us to talk about this again afterwards, because you notice like some of this discussion is not just about what a government's doing, but also about what other organizations, civil society, NGOs, and communities, what they're doing. So, okay, so let's break and come back whenever they tell us to. Okay.
Tem chazinho. Before we move on, I need to ask you if somebody identifies these t-shirts. Look at the t-shirts. It looks nice. It was found in the toilets. Yeah, somebody forgot. Okay, and nobody recognizes this t-shirt? No? Okay, if you know anybody that lost a t-shirt, inform that the t-shirt will be here. Okay? Okay. Vamos falar isso em inglês? Não, não é earring, it's the thing of the ear. We found this. It's not an earring, it's the thing that you fix the earring in your ear. Tarraxinha. Agora fala isso em inglês, um brigadeiro para você. Tarraxinha, é. Esse é tarraxinha. Hein, Fábio, como é que fala tarraxinha? Ó, if anybody lost... Ó, não tá valendo mais o brigadeiro. Look for her, she has the tarraxinha, ok? É, do brinco. Alguma coisa a mais? Did anybody lose anything? Dollars? No, okay. So, we are back. Thank you.
Thank you. We need the PowerPoint again. Oh, there it is. Oh, it just appeared. Okay. Okay, so thank you for the participation in the first half, and now now I'm going to continue on and be ready also to you be ready to intervene as we go along here as well. So I've talked about different aspects of governance and now I'm in the sequence that has to do with different kinds of approaches for ocean and fishery governance. And so this one I've already spoken to you about in different ways, about the conservation and stewardship idea. Once I was told by a Brazilian that there's not a good word for stewardship in Portuguese, but is that so? Like stewardship, like what my indigenous friends in Canada, in one language, they call taking care of. So they translate from their indigenous language. They translate stewardship to be taking care of something. So the something is whatever you are taking care of. So anyway, conservation and stewardship. So some years ago, Jake Rice, who was here last week, and I and our colleague Serge Garcia, who for many years led the Fishery Resources Division of the FAO in Rome, we produced this book that you see here that well, actually, you see a slide of the cover of the book. The book itself is many hundreds of pages, but I believe that Jake had on your reading list 1 or 2 chapters from this book, and there are more chapters available too. The idea that why we produced this book was that Garcia and Rice, who worked a lot at the international level, we're seeing that there was conflict in the governance or the decision-making between the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, which has its main objective is to have people have food. It's food for people. And then the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, which is, its main mandate is biodiversity conservation. And so there were some tensions or conflicts at the international level. And we also saw that there could be these conflicts at the local level as well. For example, in a country, between the Environment Department or Environment Ministry and the Agriculture or Fisheries Ministry. And then even at a local level of a community, the NGOs or ONG that are involved in conservation perhaps, and then the fishing people, the fishing communities and so on. So we asked many different authors to write chapters in this book about the different kinds of ways that the governance of fisheries, marine fisheries, and the governance of biodiversity conservation, how those come together or have a conflict. So we've talked about what governance is, about the decision making, so both the management aspects, the different rules of management, but also the involvement of different people. And in this case, the word governance is a particularly good word because we were focusing on the people, as some of you pointed out, the networks of participants in the decisions, the power, the different power that people have to be involved in decisions, and the institutions that are involved. So that was the governance aspects that we were looking at in this book. And so for me, this was an opportunity to look at, because I work a lot on fisheries, and especially small-scale fisheries, to look at how the fishery governance was connecting to the conservation governance. And that's, in a sense, the theme of what we looked at here. And so we focused in on these, what we call two different streams of governance. You won't see that term very often. We just liked the idea of the conservation stream and the sustainable use or fisheries management stream. And we were looking at the interaction between those two. And we discovered that there is a whole spectrum. It's not really these two. So two streams is too simplistic, because there are, for example, environmental organizations that are very supportive of what is called sustainable use of the oceans. So environmental groups that want to have sustainable use. And then there are fishery people, like I've said before, who are very enthusiastic about conservation. Excuse me. But there is also the extremes. And so the discussion earlier about this particular NGO in Brazil that is looking at sea turtle conservation is very interesting, because that's just one NGO, but different NGOs have different ways of looking at the connection with local communities and how much power and control the NGO has, or the government, or the communities. So that's a very sort of social science way to discuss it, but it's essentially who is allowed to make the decision. And it's what I called earlier under the heading of rights. I call it management rights, the right to be involved in management. Who has that right? That's a good question. So in Canada, I'm a Canadian, and so so technically I am one of the owners of the fisheries in the ocean. Because it's a state property, I'm a citizen, so in a sense I'm an owner of the fish in the ocean. But generally, I do not have much power to make decisions about the use of the ocean, because I'm just a person who's a university researcher, and that's not where the power is so much. So who actually is able to make those decisions? So these are a couple of diagrams, and too complicated to go into fully here, but what we looked at was the history. The history is quite interesting. In the history, and this actually is just coincidentally the same time frame as that cod fishery diagram, starting in 1850. And so this is fishery governance over time. And you'll notice here that it's trying to give a flavor of how back in long ago, most fisheries were traditionally self-governed because there wasn't a big government program to manage fisheries. And then in the early 1900s, along came fishery science. We got more and more centralized, top-down governance up here. Now we're seeing more market, kind of economic-focused decision-making that's based on eco-certification ideas, the Marine Stewardship Council in a sense, something called rights-based, and down here, shared community-based approaches. So there's been this trend over time, and then we looked at the biodiversity conservation trend, and so this is the formalized approaches for dealing with biodiversity conservation. And you see that early on it was all traditional self-governance as well, because there was no biodiversity convention back then. So things were sort of left somewhat to local areas. And then we start to get this term fortress conservation, kind of keeping people out of areas. That became popular and still is in some cases. And then we have this, what we call classical top-down, and the yellow here is still the local, and this is sort of new popular approaches or populist approaches. The point is that we're looking at these different trends in decision-making from this was from a history point of view. This was like the first chapter of the book. And this is way too complicated, but I just want to say here that what we also looked at is how different mechanisms bring these two different streams together over time and through different kinds of institutions. So here's what I was talking about like earlier: integrated management, integrated assessment, ecosystem approach. This is marine spatial planning, which is a bit like integrated ocean management. So different mechanisms in the middle here for connecting up the fisheries side and the biodiversity side. And so these are different ways that we have a chance to bring together the institutions that are looking at the human uses of the ocean and the institutions that want to protect biodiversity and protect the ocean. And those, how do those come together? So for example, the whole idea of an ecosystem-based management and integrated management, that's one of those mechanisms that can help us to talk about the importance of the ecosystem, but also the importance of different uses of the ocean. Because the people using the ocean are connecting through ecosystem-based management with the with those that are focused on the ecosystem health. So this idea at the very global level of bringing these together, we see this sometimes with individual NGOs, non-governmental organizations as well, that at a local level that understand that link of sustainable use with biodiversity conservation. And this brings me to something I've mentioned many times already, this idea of co-management, cooperative management. It's the idea of, you know, the CO there is for the cooperative aspect between different stakeholders. And in this case, I like to call this the triangle of co-management. Government is, although we heard some good, nice examples earlier before the break of cases where there really isn't government around, and so it's all done by the local community. And that's really an interesting situation. But we also have very top-down situations that are all done by the government. And in terms of participation, and this is meant to, you know, in this case, a fishery diagram. So the people in the fishery, or if you want to change that to ocean users instead of fishers. So pescadores is not a sexist term, I don't think. But in English, we have fishermen, and just like we have firemen, who are the people that put out fires. But now we have, do you all know this anyway? Now we have this term fisher, which researchers tend to use in English writing, which is like a gender-neutral way of referring to fishing people. You could say fisher folk, but that's kind of, I don't know, it doesn't, and many of the women I know who fish don't like this word. They would rather be called a fisherman. But anyway, we use fisher for academic. It's really difficult because when I work with fishing people, I like to use the word that they like to use, but in academic circles now, if you say fisherman, it sounds not so good. This is like one of those distractions like I was doing earlier, you know, where I got off the topic, but you know, if you're dealing with different language, it's really interesting, but fisher is sort of the accepted academic term, I think, or like research term. But anyway, so I like this triangle because you don't have to be at one of the corners. In fact, in most cases, you cannot be located at one of these corners. If it's totally top-down government, well, then you're up at the top corner here. If it was totally a community just doing everything, it would be down in this corner. If somehow the fishers had all the say, like the fisher organization, you'd be there. But very often we're somewhere else in here. In Canada, apart from our indigenous communities, the government doesn't recognize actual coastal communities, fishing communities, as having any power or involvement at all. So for them, for government in Canada, they would always be on this line down here. If they're totally top down, they'd be here. If they're involving some fishing organizations, they'd be somewhere in between. With indigenous communities, they're forced to deal with the community, and so they'd be somewhere on this side here. But then the community itself would bring its own fishing people involved, so they would end up somewhere in the middle. So you could actually use this triangle to kind of say, well, okay, what is the situation with the involvement of these three different participants? And if we weren't talking about the fishery, if we were talking about ocean, it would be the same thing, except here you'd have ocean users more generally, because it could be ocean mining or tourism or fish farming and so on. So co-management, and there's lots of challenges with co-management, and lots of stuff has been written about this. You'll never find it if you Google governance, by the way, as I said before. Like there's been hundreds of papers on co-management and understanding what are the mechanisms that make it work. And so these are a few of them. Some of the needs, like for example, appropriate incentives and rights, that's really important. Who has the right, again, to be involved in the management decisions? The scale of the system. Some of you might know famous political scientist who won a Nobel Prize for economics. So two social sciences there, right? She's a political scientist, but she won a Nobel Prize for economics. Elinor Ostrom, right. So Elinor Ostrom is famous for trying to figure out what are the ingredients that make these kind of situations work at a local level, not just for fisheries, but for, like, for example, irrigation in the United States. She was American. And you know, finding the right scale was actually one of the crucial things, because if it gets too big, then it's really hard for a local group to manage. But you can have co-management at a national level if what you're focusing on is not local communities, but on like a national fishery organization and a national government. Right? So the scale can work at a large level if you make certain compromises, I guess. So co-management, and then you know, another kind of somewhat related topic is community-based management, and this is big in if your interest, and I don't think it's probably too many people here, but if your interest was in forests, a forest system, if your interest was, you know, in Amazonian forests or Canadian forests or something like that, you would still be able to talk about community-based resource management, CBRM in that case, or in this case too, fisheries. CBRM is general community-based resource management. In this case, this is a publication that a group of us did several years ago. It's available on the website of the Community Conservation Research Network, which I'm going to talk to you about, and there's a few pamphlets around on that. And it's basically a guidance on how, well, it's a handbook for the community people to manage and make decisions about their fisheries, including everything from how do you deal with government around stock assessments or resource assessments, to how do you deal with conflicts in your own group of people? What do you do with people who break the rules? You know, in studies of like kind of laws and people follow lawbreakers, illegal activity, not just in fisheries or oceans, but anywhere, there's this idea that even if people agree with the rules, there will still be people breaking the rules. And I've heard the amount could be like 10% of the group, but it might be less depending on the situation. There's always going to be rule breakers. And what I found, you know, really amazing in my part of Canada after that cod fishery collapse, and before as well, was that when people started doing this co-management business, when the fishing people started doing it, getting involved with the decision-making, making the rules that they were going to follow, they became really strong about wanting to see the rules enforced. Think about that, right? Like, it used to be that the biggest hero in town was the person who could successfully beat the government rules. The person who would most successfully fish illegally and make money from it. Like, they were the heroes. And then it became opposite to that. It became that the rule breaker was the person who didn't get invited to the parties and didn't go to the bar with their friends because nobody wanted them around if they were going to break the rules, because the fishing people had spent days and weeks making the rules up. And then, you know, they don't want to see them broken. So it was really like a revelation, we would say, perhaps. So, yeah, like I say, you can get this on our website. And I started getting really enthused about this community role in conservation. This is from a poster I did it was for something at the Smithsonian Institution in US, if you've heard of that thing. I got kind of really keen on it. Coastal communities saving the seas, and talking to governments and NGOs, save money by getting the community support so that they would do some of the enforcement and the management, and like, you don't have to do as much government if you will, you know, hand over some of the power to communities. And that led to this project that we've been doing for almost 7 years now, the Community Conservation Research Network, that is asking this question: how do communities protect their environment and sustain their local economy at the same time? And another one: how can governments help? We didn't start with that second one, by the way, but then it started to be clear that the link to the policy world and government was really important. And so we're working in various parts of the world. Communityconservation.net. You can see pictures of at least a couple of people in the room here at that website, communityconservation.net. And I'm just going to give you a quick feel for a couple of the places that that this project has been working with. This is an indigenous part of Canada, indigenous community on the very west Pacific coast of Canada. Like if you look on the map and you think, if you go like west to Vancouver, you haven't gone far enough, and if you go west further to Victoria, you haven't gone far enough. Anyway, it's way on the west side of Vancouver Island. And that's one of the communities in the area. And this is that term that I was telling you about, taking care of, which is the equivalent of stewardship. And it's more than conservation. It's like taking responsibility for something, taking care of. And so uathluk is the Nachalnith word that translates that way. When I saw it, I couldn't believe it. What? You're missing something. Taking care of what? And it turns out it doesn't really matter. I mean, it depends what you're talking about. So they have certain principles, really cool principles, which I can't pronounce properly. The bottom one, that's two I's together, by the way, ithak, caring for everyone and everything, or respect it means. And the top one, everything is one, everything is connected, which is very much kind of the spirit of that technical term that we were talking about earlier, that when you go from talking about a single species to talking about the bigger ecosystem approach, ecosystem-based management. But they had these principles long before ecosystem-based management jargon was around. Oh, Punta Allen. Oh, I forgot I had this in this. Okay, Punta Allen. A couple of you know Punta Allen. It's in Mexico, in the Quintana Roo area. They fish for lobsters, the big thing here, and this is how they themselves, by themselves, created territorial use rights in fisheries. It's in the Siancan protected area. That's so on the east coast of sticking out into the Caribbean. But these squares or funny shapes in here are all individual fishing territories of individual fishers in this area, fishing for lobster. And so they've assigned themselves these fishing areas. And what that means is that it's a conservation tool, but also a sharing kind of tool. And if one of these areas, oh, by the way, some of you I know are interested in climate change, and this community is one where as the rain patterns change, the salinity of this bay here can change, and that changes the behavior of the lobsters in the bay, which is a big crisis for the local fishers who have been dealing with it. And as the salinity changes, it means that areas that sometimes are good for fishing lobster might be bad in a certain time. And so they have an arrangement for, if somebody happens to be in an area that just doesn't have anything to catch, they will be allowed to work with somebody else in a different location and sort of gain some of the benefits so that they don't lose out entirely. In other words, they themselves combined an equity aspect, a social aspect, with an economic aspect and a conservation aspect. Because by having these territories, it's a kind of natural conservation tool, because the responsibility is increased that way. And now later on, I might be told that I got this wrong from those here who know about it. But, Galapagos Islands. This is just to remind me that I'm talking about the Galapagos Islands here, but this is a case where, the whole islands are a national park. but I don't want to focus, so it's a protected area, and that's important, but it's important for like this one here. But for me, the big feature is the people, the government, the NGOs, and the fishing people working together. Yes, it has to do with the national park, but they're working together on managing a whole range of different fishery resources. And so actually the guy on the right here is one of the lead fishery representatives in the area. So it's the kind of co-management arrangement, like they're trying to create co-management. And working with my student, Mauricio Castrillon, we have a paper, journal article that's about spatial ecosystem-based management through co-management in this case. So we've got a bunch of kind of lessons that we've drawn over time from this project. And, so this is a way of saying, if you know what Facebook is, you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter too. So some key messages. One is that conservation itself is essential in the community sense to livelihoods and economies. By the way, you'll notice that these are not written about, they don't say specifically marine conservation or oceans or something, because we actually are not only dealing with the ocean. So our project's also dealing with inland areas, desert areas, forest areas, and so on. And so we're trying to find general principles. Involving local communities leads to better results. Excluding communities can lead to disaster, which is kind of a conflict and failure. That was the line that we put out in a press release, like to the media, when we developed these, because it's kind of like a warning in a sense. Community knowledge and this idea of scaling up and scaling down, which means finding the right scale or linking the community scale to bigger scales. I always have thought that countries, nations could learn a lot by looking at what local communities do in certain settings. But usually they don't bother because they assume that whatever's happening in a local community is just sort of local. But actually the messages can be much bigger than that. We produced a book from some of these experiences called Governing the Coastal Commons, and it's all about the coast, so it's not about the open ocean. But that just came out a year ago or so. Armitage, myself, and Fikret Berkus, maybe so, many of you will have read some stuff by Fikret Berkus, I suspect, perhaps. So we have this website, and this is just to advertise the website, where we have a resource center. So if you're interested in these ideas of local conservation solutions, we are trying to really develop a resource center for that at the same website. And there's some cards around here about this initiative we have. I can tell from your discussion earlier that quite a few of you actually have local examples of a particular place in the world where there's something going on that has to do with a community and the environment and local livelihoods. Community, environment, local livelihoods. What we're trying to do is crowdsource, or gather together from all over the world, examples on a map and it's all indexed and kind of validated. And so we're trying to build up a database on a map of these examples. So not just our own, but going to anybody who has got an example that there's some evidence to validate it. Okay, now I want to shift a little bit into something a little different here. Still talking about marine social ecological systems, but I want to focus in on climate change. Just before I do that, and I'll go back to this, before I go into these examples, and I will give some examples as well here, but let me just see, did anybody have any comment or question perhaps about anything so far? Thank you. Yeah, one at the back there. Yeah, just one here and then.
I am Jose from Colombia. Co-management requires empowerment of people. But what kind of capacities do communities need in face of global market and more drivers and pressures of other scales, not just local scale?
Yeah, sorry, how do they connect with a bigger scale?
Yes, because environmental changes are produced in other scales that affect the local environment. So what communities may do or can do in face of other problems, I don't know.
Yes, no, that's a great point. Yeah, so when I started working with local communities, and many years ago, I guess it's like 25, after that cod fishery collapse, I got interested, and I started to read the work of Elinor Ostrom and some of my colleagues like Fikret Berkus, and I got very excited about local communities. But not all the problems can be solved by a local community, right? So climate change cannot be stopped by one local community, but the community can find ways to adapt to climate change. Well, I'm going to talk about that. But I think to get to your point, so there's a kind of a governance aspect about what's called multi-level governance. So you can make some decisions in a local community, but some decisions you have to make at a bigger scale, like a scale of a state, like São Paulo state, where we are here, or the scale of a country, or even of the United Nations. So I'm really interested in the point that you're raising about how, this is why when I work with the United Nations, one thing I'm most interested in is coming up with international policies that support what goes on in local communities all around the world. So at the international level, the small-scale fishery guidelines I was talking about is about empowering local communities, but it's a global guidelines. So I think the important thing is both is to work at different levels at the same time. Not everything is just one community, but if you think about the community scale, then you can find answers at higher levels that are not so obvious. Like, for example, the idea that we were talking about earlier of social cohesion, you find that at a local community. You can be inspired at the local community, but maybe that can also be used at higher levels, like a whole state, for example. So it's a really good point. Was there? Yes, another. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. My name is Bruno from Brazil. I would like to talk about that slide you showed us about participation of fishers, of the community and the government. And what makes me wonder about how do you measure the participation of the people? And regarding this work of human dimensions regarding ecosystem-based management, I would like to hear from you, how do you work with not only the qualitative assessment of this, but the quantitative, how can you measure of these human and social dimensions? Thank you.
The qualitative and the quantitative measurement.
Especially the quantitative. Because the qualitative is, I think, is more common, but the quantitative is not easy, I imagine.
For ecosystem-based management.
Well, regarding human dimensions.
Yes, right. Yes, another very, well, 2 points there, and I'm quickly going to forget the first one, but I'll answer the second one. So the measurements, right. Quantitative measurements, well, I've had students who have developed indicators, maybe this is your first one too, who have developed indicators, quantitative indicators of participation in ecosystem-based management or integrated management. And so that's fairly common. It's like any measurement, well, almost any measurement, it has its difficulties. So for example, you can count the number of meetings that are held in a region in a year. You can, and then the more meetings you have, you could say, well, that's more participation. You can count the number of people that come to the meetings. That's okay too. You can count the number of groups of people who come to the meetings. So for example, to be sure that you're not only getting men coming to the meetings, you want to look at men and women, and you might care about the youth and the elders. So these different groups, like you might count these groups. So there are quantitative ways of trying to get an idea there, but there's also, of course, the qualitative ways that come from interviewing people and finding out, are they happy with the participation? I have another student in Canada who's just finished her master's interviewing fishery organizations about, are they happy with the co-management arrangements that they have in their fisheries? Are they happy, and what areas do they feel there should be more participation? So that's good too. You don't get, I mean, and actually, I mean, in some sense, she has generated quantitative numbers from that, because if you add up the number of people, then, or you could say 65% think there should be more participation, which is quantitative. So yeah, it's a very good point. Maybe because I started as a mathematician, I'm very interested in quantitative aspects of social science and governance. Not everybody wants that, but I'm quite interested in that because it is challenging. Yeah. Any, yes, please.
Yes. Hi, Tony. Thanks for your lecture. I'm Deborah from Brazil. I really liked your key ideas in ocean governance, but I'd like to listen a little bit more from you. Which could be the key factors for these co-management arrangements or collaborative governance arrangements that we already have between communities and the government, but especially regarding, for example, Latin America's contexts that we have, like social inequalities, poverty, and in many cases a recent democracy. So regarding this meaningful participation of fishers in decision making, how to deal with this context of poverty, recent democracies, and social inequalities?
Yes, it's an idea that sounds good in theory and in a PowerPoint presentation, but you're very correct that that, for example, in situations of poverty or food insecurity, for example, it's very difficult to get people to spend their time going to a meeting, like, you know, measuring this, what we were just talking about, measuring participation. It's very difficult, but I think some things are possible. You know, leadership becomes very important, and I just, what's today? On Saturday, I was in a small community called Villa dos Pescadores, just in Cubatao, and not far from here. And it's a remarkable, it's quite rare in a sense, because it's a fishing community that's also an urban slum community. And there's a lot of poverty there. But they also have the world's best leader as well. The leadership is amazing there. So somehow, you know, there can be ways to overcome something. They would like to see more government support in their community, and there again, that would be a big factor. Would be actually governments creating mechanisms to support at the community level, kind of financing mechanisms and capacity building mechanisms. So yeah, there's no easy answer to your challenging question, but I think that, and I'm not even going to try the one about new democracies, but there's certainly some, I think some ingredients that help out. and leadership and government support that isn't government dictating, like, you know, yeah. Speaking of new democracies, but anyway, yeah. So there's certain mechanisms I think that have been shown to help. But yeah, you know, poverty and food insecurity. This is the work I'm doing with FAO now. How do you? I think I'm going to get to this too. How do you do climate adaptation in a situation where you have such poverty and food insecurity? You know, that in itself is difficult. Is the microphone somewhere? Ah, yes.
Hi, I'm Adan from Mexico. First, I love the approach that you have because first, I believe in the need to integrate this vision, but because we talk about management, co-management, fisheries, governance, and we don't talk about human, people, father, mother, so I love this vision. But in another hand, the discourse about the need to integrate this vision is more and more, and the problem is the same. So what can I do to make this vision and finally don't transform it in a panarchy of the conservation or yeah, the sustainable management?
Sorry, the last part.
What can it do to talk about this vision and do this vision and don't transform this concept in a panarchy to conservation of the biodiversity?
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, things sometimes take time to develop, and there's a risk of yeah, there is a risk of losing the good things if they are taken over by, say, you know, if you want government to be supportive, but not to take things over necessarily, like in terms of the local initiatives. It's like a big, like the governance picture is like a big ecosystem that an ecologist is trying to understand, because there's so many things happening. You know, there's these different levels of decision making. There's different power structures that, you know, different players have different amount of power. There's different issues that come up. So, so some of the fishing communities I work with are not only concerned about fishing. The Vila dos Pescadores community, I mean, they're concerned about, well, some of them are concerned about fishing, but they're also concerned about urban infrastructure services, because they're an urban slum community, and so that has nothing to do with fish. It has to do with, you know, and also they're worried that they're going to be forcibly relocated to somewhere else because some government might not think that they're very pretty or attractive. So I mean, there's all sorts of issues that go beyond the strict narrow one. But I think, you know, what the one mechanism I would be very keen on, if I got to just tell all governments of the world to have one particular mechanism, it would be like a financial and empowerment mechanism for governments to support local communities. Like just set up a fund with some nice amount of money in it, and then take proposals from different communities, and then you need somebody to help Vila dos Pescadores because they need help in writing the proposals, but some of you could do that. So there's ways of, I think there's concrete mechanisms that you can use for this kind of increasing the involvement of the communities. Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Luana, I'm from Brazil. Thank you also for this speak, because I'm really into this topic and bringing like communities with government and science. I've been working in a community with, there's no centralized powers, so the association is really weak. And I feel like science always talks centralizing power, and then we need to go to a meeting with the community. But when you face a community where it's not centralized, like when there's no leadership, then I would like to know if you ever worked with one like this, and which mechanism we can use. Because I've lived 3 months there, and I went house by house interviewing, but then I thought, well, culture change and the demands change. How can you do this like 3 times a year for a good management approach, you know?
So like, how can we work with not centralized communities, like coastal communities mainly?
Like where one community, you want to work with the community, but the community doesn't have a clear leadership
Yeah,
structure.
they used to have, because culture, like parties and building houses, but now not anymore because of a lot of things like religion or tourism coming and one work individually working. But then, well, you don't hold parties for management and they don't go anymore, so. And the meetings is like 8 people for all the community, is not like representative.
I don't know. Okay. Any other questions? No, sorry. That's too hard. All I can say there, I mean, is that one thing I guess I've learned is you don't have to have the whole community coming to a meeting. You'll never get the whole community coming to a meeting. And so one nice situation is if you have the leadership coming to the meeting. And in Villa dos Pescadores, we had the main leader and a whole group of his sort of support people. They came to meet with us. But so that's, you know, I mean, they have a very difficult situation, but they have the leadership. But in some other places, it might be the women who get together to do something as a group, like a group of women that get together, and they care about their community, and they're what we would call your entry point in. Like if you can find out that there's this group of women that meet on a Thursday and do a certain something, I don't know what, like that could be it. Or it could be a group of young people that play football but they really want to do something for their community. Like, so you can't tell exactly, but I do think you need some kind of entry point. Otherwise it's so difficult. But it could be an entry point that is not written in the textbooks. You know, like you just, well, maybe it's written by somebody, but you just don't know that there's women that get together to play cards every Thursday until you sort of find out somehow. And I mean, playing cards, I don't know. You know, like they get to, it could be social, right? I mean, it doesn't have to be they're working for the community. It could be that they just have always thought that they should do a community project, and along comes somebody from outside. By the way, I want to, number one, I do want to get on to my other piece here, but number two, I want to make clear, because I know many of you are natural science oriented, and one thing I think is important is that this kind of engaging with communities is not something that's only for the social science people, you know, the ones that really want to do something on governance. It can also be very much for the natural science people. But of course, you're engaging in a different way, like you're not trying to help them with their governance necessarily, but some communities I've worked with in Canada, they really didn't want to see a bunch of social scientists. They actually wanted help on knowing what to do with a particular fish that they're dealing with. And so you can, you know, if you come in with some biology or some oceanography, for example, another one is a couple of oceanographers that happen to live in a community down south of where I live. They do amazing work in helping the fishing community figure out how the nutrients and contaminants are moving around this bay. So I mean, there's lots of engagement. The important thing for a natural scientist to realize, though, is that you're not a social scientist. You're not trained in that kind of line. So you know, everybody needs to know their boundaries. I'm not an anthropologist, and I just don't know the methodologies or anything of anthropology. I can talk respectfully about anthropology and what they offer, but I don't offer it myself. And I don't have much skills at all anymore, but you know, I used to be a mathematician. So anyway, but it's important to know that that you know, you're offering something, and if what they want is that something, then you've got, you know, a good engagement.
We have 3 more. Can we do this?
3 more questions? Yes. And then I'll give you the rest of my 5-hour lecture.
I didn't present myself before. I'm Mariana from Brazil. Here in Brazil, we don't have any more fisheries data, statistics. We don't monitor, government doesn't do, and we had some secretaries for fisheries and ministry, but they are all over or corrupted or something like this. So I wanted you to know from you, because when we talk about fisheries management and with local communities, we need data to make the stock assessment or something like this, because they feel they don't have more fish. We know that there's no more fish like before, but we don't have data. And I wanted you to comment about some examples of how to collect this data from artisanal fisher, local community, and especially like here in Brazil, we have so many different cultures of fisher communities. And how can we collect this data? Do you have good examples of how we feel, like people that I research with feel that it has to be voluntary from fishermen and women? It's the only way if they collect the data and give it to us. For the industrial sector, it's easier because you have this production reports from the industries, but from local communities and small communities, it's a challenge for us. How do you have an example? How to do is impossible to answer, but if you have some examples, please.
Yeah. Well, that point about about data collection, there's a number of different aspects there. One that's kind of a classic one is classic, I say, in the sort of field of new ways of thinking about dealing with fisheries and oceans, is involving the people in the data collection. I mean, that is sort of become so accepted now as a good thing. Involving the people in collecting the data. That might be the fishing people out in their boats who are helping by taking water temperature measurements or something, or it might be just that they're recording their observations of where the marine mammals are located. Like there are many different things that they can do. But also on the coast, the people living who aren't out fishing, there's observations they can make too about the weather and some of the winds and different aspects. It depends what kind of information is important. But then there's also, and again, this is like I was just saying about what natural scientists can contribute. There's many communities I find where they want trained scientists. Like they see that they would like a trained scientist to tell them about some particular sort of parasite that seems to be on the fish. Like certain people would know about that. They'd love them to do that. Or why is it that there doesn't, that the fish seem to be in different location than where they used to be? Like that's not something that the local knowledge might identify that the fish have moved, but why they moved, that might be something that scientists could help them with. So I guess the bottom line is that there's involving the local people can be really good for some kinds of knowledge. Catch levels, for example, how much catch the fishers have got, like that's a classic one. But there's also a role for the outside person, like in Eastport, the community I was telling you about. They knew they wanted to protect their lobster. They knew something about their lobster fishing areas, but they needed some scientists to come in and show them how, or demonstrate that in fact these were spawning areas, certain locations. So there's some things that can be done that way. There's also, I think, an understanding that that sometimes you don't need as much information. We don't need as much information as we think we need as researchers. That maybe, and this is again something I've learned from Caribbean colleagues who say, well, northern methods of stock assessment are very data intensive. There are ways of doing a more simple kind of analysis, which is not necessarily bad. So there's a few options. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. I'm Nancy from Kenya. my question is about conservation and stewardship. Maybe there might be a difference, okay, there is a difference between Canada and other countries like Kenya and other developing.
Okay, I have to agree with you there. Yes.
Yeah, so when you talk about stewardship, it is not an easy thing in like countries like Kenya. Like I've been doing a lot of community education and volunteer programs like beach cleanups, and you find that this is something that needs, it's a volunteer thing, we don't have resources, so it's because what you are seeing, you try to tell the people. But you find that even the young generation, because we have the universities, we invite the people, but the first thing people ask you is that, is there any payment? So how do you convince the people that you don't need to be paid to conserve the environment? And then another thing is about the community participation. When you talk about community participation, it means that we are moving from the top-down approach of management to the bottom-up approach of environmental management. So you find that in countries like in Kenya, we have been using the top-down approach, whereby the government creates the rules and then it forces it on people. So people have been having a negative attitude towards resources. So when you tell somebody about fisheries, mangroves, forests, they say that, oh, that belongs to the government. When you tell somebody that, let's go clean the beaches, they'll tell you, I don't go to the beach. And that is for the government. So the government need to clean it. You see this? So how do we involve the people? Like how do we change the attitude of the people so that they know that this is something for all of us?
Oh, wow. Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, so let's, you know, I think one thing that's really important is to realize that that in many locations, including my home country, governments have almost ruined the traditional methods of caring for the environment and the resources. They've got influenced by this sort of top-down. Those history diagrams I was showing kind of showed this trend. It was hard to tell, but. And there's, again, a famous article from the South Pacific Islands about the loss of traditional management approaches. So not everywhere, I mean, not everywhere has had these traditional management approaches, but in the South Pacific, in like Fiji area, and there's people here that might correct me on this, but there were historically traditional management, and it got kind of lost, and now to some extent it's being recovered because people have, and governments have sort of realized that that's actually more effective than the top-down approach. But meanwhile, there's been decades of this loss, as you described, this loss of sort of the stewardship feeling, and as you also say, there's, which is a sort of different situation, but there's also a real financial issue with going to meetings and like getting paid for doing something. And so that's an added challenge. But I guess if I could just focus on the other one of recovering the respect for nature and the environment that we've lost when we think that it's just up to the government to do it and it's up to the top-down approach and so on. How do we get that back? The fishery people in my part of Canada got some of that back when they were kind of authorized to do this co-management arrangement. They didn't have it before. Like I say, they thought that it was all up to government, and their goal was to beat the government by fishing illegally. Like, that was their goal. Once, you know, if the bad government is in charge, then the fun thing for us is to beat the government. But now that's all sort of changed, except for the rule breakers. That most fishers want to arrest them. But anyway, so how do we recover that? I mean, it's incredibly hard after decades of thinking, you know, differently. Many indigenous communities in Canada have the same issue with their traditional practices being lost with the government taking over. And you know, they are trying to, and I don't have the answer, by the way, like one thing you don't want to do is to tell somebody in another part of the world what to do, especially if my goal is to have community-based approaches. I shouldn't tell other communities what to do, but our indigenous communities are quite inspiring. They've lost a whole lot, and they've been discriminated against in Canada, but the big goal right now is to try to recover some of their traditional practices. And their language, by the way, but that's another thing. And so I think, like education, you mentioned education, but I think the education has to go beyond the immediate need of, like I don't know, if the immediate need is to protect sea turtles, you might not be able to start with that. You might have to start with, why do you care about your land? And what do you get from the ocean? And start very, very broadly about that. Like the values thing that I started with earlier. But again, I can't be sure, but it's a really tough one that you're identifying there. Oh my goodness. Where's the, oh, sorry.
I have the microphone.
He's got the microphone. Yeah, but look at them over there.
Yeah. I'm Shala from Nigeria. I'm just wondering if it is possible that the Canadian tragedy you mentioned, it is possible to be repeated. Taken in line with the collapse of the northern fishery in New Zealand. Thinking about, have that at the back of our mind, I noticed that most of the key players in the industrial fishery just moved from the Pacific, possibly, to the coast of the Gulf of Guinea, down to the, close to Mozambique, Seychelles, Mauritius. And without proper stock assessment, much of unregulated small fisheries, and then you see have this small, large-scale fishery going on. With your involvement in FAO, do you foresee a repeat of the collapse of what happened in Canada and in New Zealand several years ago?
Oh, that's a great question. Along the lines of, I didn't get to this sort of personal opinion that I have that I'm going to give now, which is that northern and industrialized fisheries have a lot to learn from developing country fisheries. And part of the reason is why we had a collapse of our cod fishery in Canada was we were very centralized. All of the assessments, all the management was all centralized. It became quite industrialized. There were small-scale fisheries, but there's some evidence that the government scientists and managers did not listen to the small-scale fishers. They listened to the industrial fishing, and so a lot of the focus was on the industrial fishery. And so for me, I think that, for example, understanding the ecosystem has been recognized in coral reef fisheries for far longer than it was ever recognized in more northern and industrial fisheries. By industrial, I include, for example, the anchovy and sardine fishery off the coast of Peru, which is largely industrial. I mean, so it's not only in the north, but when you get industrial, you get a different attitude, and I think attitudes are important. So I guess my point there is that could it happen again? Yes, and I suspect if it happens again, it will be in industrialized fisheries that you'll get some kind of big collapse. It's like the bigger you are, the harder you fall, or something like that. But some more small-scale fisheries can still be depleted, and so you have to watch out for that. But I suspect not too many of them would collapse in the same way that our fishery collapsed, because there's more, in most small-scale fisheries, there's more diversity of species being utilized and more kind of spreading of the pressure to different species and locations. So this is just my kind of assessment. But so I would be worried mostly about industrial fisheries in that case. Yeah. Yes, please.
Hello, I'm Dragana from Serbia. And I just wanted to add to Nancy's question, because she talked about how people have a negative attitude. And I wanted to ask you, because especially in my country, it's not about fisheries or about the ocean because Serbia is a landlocked country, but for climate change and preserving the nature and everything, I've noticed that a lot of people have an indifferent attitude. Like they do care about nature and they do want to help and preserve and, I don't know, contribute, but their feeling is, what can I do? I'm just one person, and if I turn off the lights every time, that's not going to do anything to save energy, or that's not going to have an impact at all. So who am I to do anything? So why do it? So my question is, how do we educate the people? How do we let them know that even the smallest thing, the smallest action can contribute and can help?
Yeah, it's a good point. Well, I don't have all the answers to that one, but I suppose the theme that fits with what I've been saying here in particular is that when you get this idea of what we call collective action, where people come together and it could be the group of women in the community or a group of young people, or it could be different kinds of people, but I find that the most effective thing is where you're not only approaching individual people as if they were atoms bouncing around in space, but you're actually approaching people in the groups that they are naturally in. And so one of those would be schools, children in schools. So, programs that educate children is such a huge thing. I was just on the coast in a fisheries museum a couple of days ago in Santos, where I was so interested to see that they had big display about plastics in the ocean. And I was interested because I'm far away from home, and at home, everybody's talking about plastics in the ocean, and children are being educated about it, and so on. And so here, I mean, I know there's internet and everything, but anyway, it was just impressive to see this about plastics here. And it was especially for school groups that come in and they play around it with all this, like it looks like a pile of garbage on the floor of the museum, which I think is really a neat thing. But it likes all this plastic as a display. So children, but also groups, reaching out to groups rather than trying to just do it, because I know like there's an idea of doing it one at a time, and that's okay. But I think to make it faster and more effective, if you get a group that learns and cares, that it helps. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Rafael. I'm sorry if you already touched this issue, but about co-management, and I myself, I have a little precautionary approach about that. For example, how to guarantee the sustainability, ecological and social, of a co-management situation when you have weak leaderships, for example, in a decision-making, stakeholders, and you have at the same table low-income and high-income groups of people and corruption in this middle, and they are deciding everything, what the planning and the decision making.
Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah. So the sustainability of the co-management arrangement.
Yes.
It's a really good point. I didn't focus on the word incentives that I had up on the screen of one thing. Economists especially like to talk about incentives, but they're usually thinking about economic incentives, but let's talk about financial and economic incentives. So I think the best co-management arrangements are ones where there's self-interest. So in other words, it's selfish. This co-management is for selfish reasons, partly. In other words, by co-managing, the fishing people or the forest people, the farmers, the people can make more money. They can have more control, and they can make more money, and they're more confident with their money that they're making if they're doing co-management. That would be the situation where it becomes sustainable, because it's not just work, it's also more income or more benefits, let's say, or more food, perhaps, like in some cases. Do you see? Like, so the incentive would be not because you care about conservation entirely, it would be also to make more money. That would be an ideal situation. And when we see co-management by fishers in Baja California that are fishing lobster, and they're certified by the Marine Stewardship Council, they put money into doing that, they put time in, but they also are making money from that. Or similarly, if we look at almost any co-management arrangement, if it's going to be sustainable, and that's a very good point, there needs to be the incentives to keep doing it, you know, to not just stop. Because once you stop, I mean, every year you have to make decisions in co-management. So every year somebody has, like, it could be a leader, but what if the leader gets tired? So you need people to think that it's a good idea. And that is a big challenge in like everywhere, because in Belize, in Central America, they have cooperatives that manage their lobster catches. But they also have the temptation, the fishing people do, to sell to make more money perhaps by selling to tourism sector. So this is kind of co-management. It's collective action anyway. And if the incentive is too great to sell somewhere else and not sell through the cooperative, then the cooperative will collapse. So you need the incentives to be good for that. I mean, it's a very good point. Yeah. Oh, yes, hi.
Sorry. I have a very specific question. Maybe I should do it later. Yes, because
okay.
So we have one more.
Okay, yeah, possibly two.
Two?
Well, I saw,
you?
I thought, but. Oh, okay. Yeah, but it's back there now.
Hi, my name is Mariana Dominguez. I'm from Venezuela. I wanted to comment about the question about how to influence people to make these changes in conducts. Well, my formation, I am a biologist, and then I did a master's in wildlife conservation and management, and I have been very interested in multidisciplinarity because I have come to know that if you want to conserve, you need to make a lot of changes in people's conducts. And recently I took a course in environmental psychology. And in order to make these changes in conducts, you have to make studies about the beliefs, the culture, the past, the education, the knowledge, the motivations of the community that you are working with. And then with that information, one of the most important things that you have to work with is emotions. Like, people are driven by their emotions, and this is when you have to study all these things, and then through their emotions try to guide the change of conducts that you want to see. So this is very important, and studies in psychology are very difficult, because if it is difficult for us to find funds for psychological studies, it is way more difficult. But, well, I wanted to give this information.
Yeah, I mean, that's very interesting, the psychology. I think it's a really important aspect. My training in economics, we also did behavioral analysis, sort of looking at this incentives idea and so on. I mean, the only challenge there is that you can use your sort of understanding of psychology and behavior to understand and sort of support the local people, but you can also potentially use it to manipulate. Like by understanding psychological reactions and behavioral, like in my training, behavioral analysis. So yeah, but it really helps to have, I think that, what key aspect is that you're looking at different disciplines, and you have this interdisciplinary, taking different courses, which can be very helpful. So yeah, it's more of that is good, which this program forces you to do it here. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Aline from Brazil, and my question is about that subject too. In Brazil, we have not fully consolidated democracy as Latin America, and our institutions are kind of weak, and we don't have a consolidated process from politics in Brazil. So my question is how to measure stakeholders' intentions into the process of governance, how to assess their motivations and how they make decisions. And it's kind of what she was talking about before.
Yeah, but also this aspect of democratic institutions and how they operate, and that point came up earlier about sort of new democracies. And I don't really have the answer to that, except that I've seen that there are cases, and some people mentioned these examples earlier, where the communities or the local groups of fishers, let's say, or the local people using the ocean have been able to do something despite the government's, despite the lack of effective government, perhaps. But it's much easier when the government is supportive. And so for me, like we were talking earlier about education of people in schools, school groups and so on, for me, one of the groups I would most like to educate is government people everywhere, to understand this idea of what is possible, even with not a lot of funding, but just the support from the government for some of these local actions. Is that more difficult to do when there's a new democracy? I don't know, but I do know that my country, which has had a democracy for a few years now, isn't especially supportive of local communities. And so I know it's not just a question of the age of the democracy that's the factor. Like governments need education to understand what is possible, just like they might need education about the importance of the oceans generally, for example. That's another area that tends to get neglected. But yeah, it's a big challenge. Educate governments. That might be my only answer there. Is there a... So I know time is almost up, and I only have 30 or 40 more slides to do. It's been really, really great. I really appreciate your participation, and you can see I guess the remaining slides are in the PowerPoint. So if you have any comments or questions on them, of course you could contact me anyway. And like I say, I've got some business cards if anybody wanted something like that. And maybe there's more questions, but if not, are we done? Oh, okay. Oh, okay. I was reading like you did. Anyway, happy to talk some more. And yeah, but I just wanted to get that little point in about how great you are. Oh yes, and I'll be around. Like I'm not leaving. Yeah, right. So I'll be here until Wednesday. With you, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Yes, thanks.
Hi, for you, I'm Amavi from Sri Lanka, and for the rest, they all know me. So yeah.
How have they got to know you?
Sorry, oh, they know me because they think that I talk a lot.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So my question is not exactly, directly related to what you presented, but this just popped in my mind when I was listening to your presentation. So I'm just curious to know about your opinion on the ethics, political, economic, and scientific ethics, their role in governance and management. So actually why I'm telling you this, because there's a story that I would like to share, but I'm not that proud of sharing. An example from my country, Sri Lanka. We have this ongoing project, Colombo Port City project. I don't know whether you're familiar with this. Actually, it's a project funded by China. And first, it was initiated, to upgrade the tourism of the country. So it's going to be another mini Las Vegas in Colombo. Actually, Colombo is our capital. And then these people, I mean the scientists and the policymakers and the government, so they made, they did environmental impact assessments and all, and they were like, okay, this is fine, you can implement this project, and they implemented. But later on, it turned out that everything was manipulated big time. So now, actually, even though China had funded us to implement the project, the port city is no longer Sri Lankan, it's Chinese. So it's been leased to them, and we are paying the price with our tax money. And for 100 years, we have to pay for the maintenance of the port city. And not only that, so the port city it's built in the coastal area, so our entire ecosystem, Colombo, the ecosystem in the coastal belt of Colombo, it's been affected, not just biology, but also the chemistry and even the current patterns and the waves and everything. So I believe, now I'm not asking for the solutions from you, of course.
Good.
Yeah, because it's not like that I can find solutions to the problems in my country from this course. But I think this is a problem with the ethics, economic, political, and scientific, of course. So I'm just curious on your opinion about this kind of a complicated situation.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, there's so much to do with ethics. I'm partly in a business school in Canada in my university, and the business school teaches, there's a compulsory course in ethics because they are conscious of how business people sometimes are not ethical in their behavior. And so the idea is you take a course to learn something about ethics. Hopefully you do. But ethical behavior, yes, like the values aspect and sort of morals and then ethics, like it's all, sometimes we think of ethics as something, well, like that course in the business school, just a thing that you learn, just like you learn oceanography or something. But it actually fits all in with values and moral behavior and those ingredients about how humans behave, in a sense. The psychology comes in there too, like was pointed out. So anyway, I mean, I think ethics is a really important element, and when you have corruption, like it's remarkable how often I hear about the fishery agency of a country having to deal with corruption in their country, or they're corrupt. That was not, I never learned about corruption when I was studying basics of fishery management or something like that. But it turns out in the real world, that's a really big ingredient of things. So, but there's no formula for dealing with it. Like it's sort of, oh, corruption, well, I guess my total allowable catch doesn't really mean much because people buy extra quota or something, I don't know. So it's a big deal anyway, yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of cultural aspects, that's right. Did you have?
Do we have time?
Well, somebody's the boss here, but
You're the boss. Oh, okay.
This is the last, I think the last question, because there's some people that want to get food probably or something. Okay. But you go ahead, don't feel any pressure.
Okay.
Just
hi,
nice and,
I'm Savannah from the United States, and my question is mostly about you working with indigenous cultures. So you, as a white man going into them, like you said that your government doesn't necessarily respect communities. So how do you go in there and have them trust you and help you? Do they reach out to you? Do you reach out to them? How exactly does that work as you not being from their community?
Right. Well, in the Canadian context, Indigenous communities are the ones that are where there's the most care needed in working with the community, and I would say, well, but every community has, as was just pointed out, it's, has culture and their history and traditions and so on. Every community, I don't mean just Indigenous, but other communities too. So, in a formal sense, in Canada, Indigenous communities are somewhat different and treated differently and so on. But for me, yeah, like I think it's really important to know somebody. And another thing I've learned, I guess, is that in many cases, my connection to the Indigenous community is through somebody in the community who is working for the community, and their job is, in a sense, to interact with me and others. And so you might say gatekeeper, or it's not a bridging organization because they're really part of the community. And then I might introduce a colleague, or a student of mine, to the community through those people. So yeah, it's a really important thing. The respect is the most important thing. I just was in Caipara communities that are kind of somewhat traditional communities in Brazil. Am I saying that correctly to say Caipara? No, I mean, are they like traditional communities in some sense? Well, that's what I tried to say. I tried to say Caipara. Okay. Oh, yeah, right. Okay, there's the other one, the Caipari. No, the other one. Caipira. Thank you. Okay, two different communities. So yeah, and they don't appreciate if you go in and you don't say their name right. Anyway, yeah. So I mean, there's various, and then there's Indigenous communities here too, and of course in the United States. Yeah, the respect and being helpful is very good too. Like if you have something to offer. Yeah, so finding the right entry point is really crucial. I mean, this is, but I get all sorts of people, students especially, asking not just about Indigenous communities, but any community. How do you get started with the community? And like it's really a challenge to do that. Like it's always helpful to know somebody that knows somebody, so that there's some interaction. Like some of you maybe work with a community, but your supervisor was the one that made the initial or had the initial connection, or maybe it was another student or some kind of way of connecting. So I mean, yeah, at the moment, like if I wanted to, well, recently some people from a conference I was hosting went to an Indigenous community, and I arranged it through a wonderful colleague of mine who was the chief of the community, and she's now a professor at a local university, and I'm just so proud of that, because Indigenous people in Canada don't often become professors. Like it's just not that common. So she is wonderful. Anyway, yeah, but the connections are not that easy. Okay, thank you.
So thank you all, and thanks Tony for all this knowledge you shared with us. You can now have lunch. We'll be back at 3 p.m. I think. For those of you who are scheduled for tutoring section with Anne Langas today, she just arrived today. She's